Welcome to Get Unstuck with Michele, the podcast where we embark on a transformative journey through the realms of the mind, spirit, and soul. I'm Michele, your shamanic coach, here to guide you through the untamed wilderness of self-discovery and personal growth. Together, we'll unravel the threads that bind us to the past, release the weight that anchors us in the present, and unfurl the wings of potential that carry us toward a vibrant, purposeful future. Join me as we explore ancient wisdom, mystical practices, and powerful insights to awaken the spirit within and break free from stagnation. Let's take that courageous step together and get unstuck.
Today, we're talking about grief. Now, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when I say grief? Probably death is your answer. And that's fair, because when we lose somebody through death, it causes us to grieve. And that is the first thing that most people think about when they hear the word grief or grieving. And that's a valid association. The problem comes in when people think that death is the only thing that causes grief. Now, the actual definition of the word grief, according to dictionary.com, is keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss. Sharp sorrow, painful regret. So, it doesn't mention death at all in that definition. It mentions loss. Now, any kind of loss can cause grief. And we do ourselves a huge disservice when we don't acknowledge that grief can happen over any loss. And by any loss, I mean the loss of a pet, the loss of a job, the loss of a dream, the loss of stability and continuity in our lives. Any kind of loss can cause keen mental suffering or distress. And that keen mental suffering or distress is grief. So, we all face loss in our lives. That's part of living a human experience. We're going to deal with loss. We're going to deal with change. So we're all going to grieve something. And you probably have experienced grief, even if you haven't lost somebody in death. And if you're listening to my podcast and you're listening to me talk right now and you have not lost somebody through death, congratulations. I want to say that. Congratulations for making it this far in your life without having lost someone. Chances are that at some point you will lose somebody in your life through death, unless you're the one who dies before anybody else does. It's just a fact of life. We all are going to experience death at some point, of course our own, but we're also going to lose people through dying at some point. And that's going to cause us grief. But other losses in our life are also going to cause us grief. And you've probably experienced some type of loss. If it hasn't been death, you've probably experienced some type of loss. We all experienced loss collectively back in 2020. So let me just go back to that. We have all experienced loss. At that point in 2020, global pandemic, COVID-19, everything was shut down the world over. Our lives changed. And that was a huge loss. And a lot of people experience grief. And one good thing, if nothing else good, came out of COVID. One good thing is that the way things changed for everyone, a collective change like that, caused more people to become aware that grief happens with losses other than just death. Now, there was a massive amount of death with COVID, so there was obviously grief related to that. But whether or not you lost someone you know to dying as a result of COVID, you experienced change and you experienced loss in your life. And that may have caused a grief response for you. It may not have. Everybody faces loss in different ways, but there has been or will be some loss in your life that causes grief. So that's the main thing I want to get across in this episode, is that grief is a keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss, and that it occurs for more than just death. But also the way we grieve is different from person to person. So I want to stay away from the topic of death in and of itself, just because I'm wanting to reiterate that grief is more than death. And I don't want to get caught up in the COVID narrative too much, so I'm going to give a different example here. Let's say you lose your job. And let's say I lose my job. We both lose our jobs. You, the person listening to me right now, and me, the person speaking right now. We both lose our job. Let's say it's a huge blow for both of us, and we both experience grief, keen mental suffering, or distress over that loss, which is a valid thing. It's valid for any loss, but it's very understandable, and that's why I'm using this example, because it's very relatable and understandable for people to experience grief over the loss of a job. But the way that I experience mental suffering or distress is going to be different than the way you experience mental suffering or distress. The exact situation may be similar yet different, but how we respond to it is going to be different. Let's say we have the same job. We work for the same company, we have the same job, everything is the same across the board, and we both lose our job. Because my life is different than your life, and because I'm a different person than you, the way I process that experience is going to be different than the way you process that experience. So the way I express my grief is going to differ from the way that you express your grief. And it's the same with any grief. We get caught up in the idea, first of all, that grief is just about death, that we only grieve if someone we know or close to dies, which I've already established that that's not true. But even if it were, but it's not, but even if it were, we also tend to think that people are supposed to respond in a certain way to grief. We tend to think that there are stages of grief, and there are common experiences that a lot of people have. We hear that there are 5 stages of grief or 7 stages of grief or however many fucking stages of grief you want to say. But when we categorize grief like that in terms of stages, like you're going to go through denial, you're going to go through anger, you're going to go through bargaining, whatever, that tends to make us think that everybody's experience is going to be the same. And if we don't experience that, or if we see somebody who isn't experiencing that, then we tend to think that they're either not grieving, or that they're grieving the wrong way, that they're avoiding grief, that they're not going to get over it, that they're prolonging their pain and suffering, whatever. But fuck that. Okay. There are, in terms of stages of grief, there are common experiences that a lot of people have. But that's not to say that it's standard and that everybody experiences it. You may lose someone close to you because they die, and you may not cry. And crying is one thing that many people associate with grief. And that's normal. It's normal to cry when somebody dies and you're grieving, but it's also normal not to cry, because we're different people and the way we experience things is going to be different. When my mother died in 2020, prior to the pandemic nightmare shit. She died at the beginning of 2020 before COVID officially got to the United States, blah, blah, whatever. So she did not die as a result of COVID, even though she died in 2020. When my mother died, I cried the day she died. And I cried maybe a handful of times since then, but generally around the exact time that she died. Now, my grandmother, my mother's mother, was still living at that time. She's since passed as well. But at the time, my grandmother was still alive. Now, my grandmother had 7 children. She actually had more pregnancies, but as far as live births that led to children who grew up, whatever, she had 7 children. And by the time my grandmother passed away in December 2022, 5 of her 7 children had passed away. So we tend to think that, one, parents are going to die before their children, and while that's normally the case, it's not always the case. Obviously, as evidenced by my grandmother and a lot of other people. My former mother-in-law is one. When my husband died at the age of 24, his mother was still alive, and that was back in 2011, and his mother just passed away in 2022. So it's not uncommon that parents outlive their children, although we tend to think that it should be not that way, and it really shouldn't, but that's part of life. But anyway, all that to say, my grandmother, when she died, had experienced the loss of 5 of her 7 adult children. My grandmother did not cry when my mother died. I do not remember her crying when any of her other children passed away. Does that mean that my grandma did not love her children or did not grieve their deaths? Absolutely not. Of course she loved her children, and she grieved a lot around the death of her children, because it's not what we tend to think should happen, that a parent should have to bury their child, their adult child, much less 5 of their adult children. So, yes, my grandma grieved, but she did so in her own way, and that did not involve tears. And what I'm trying to get across with this is that we're all individual people, and we're all going to experience grief in a different way. And we're all going to grieve over different situations. I had an experience dealing with grief over the loss of a dream that I had. And I don't want to go into the details about it, because while I've accepted that dream is never going to happen for me, no matter what I do, it's not one of those things that you can just strive for and you're going to get. It's something totally different than that. But I don't want to talk about it in detail, but I want to mention it as an example that I had this dream as a younger version of me, that as an adult I was going to experience a certain life thing, and it never happened, and it's not going to. At this point in my life, I've come to accept that that's never going to happen for me. But as I never realized that dream, and as I never manifested that reality for me, and as I got closer to the point of accepting that it was never going to be something that I would experience, I had definite mental suffering and distress over the loss of that dream. And so I grieved that, because that's what that is. Keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss is grief. I experienced grief over the loss of that dream. I have experienced loss over the death of my mother. I have experienced grief over the death of my husband. I have experienced grief over the death of all of my grandparents at this point, friends, co-workers, mentors. I've experienced a lot of death in my life, but not just the death of people. I have experienced grief over the loss of dreams, over the loss of jobs, lots of grief in my life. And that's part of why I do what I do. The energy work that I do started out originally as a response to the loss of my husband when he was 24. I was 31 at the time. This was back in 2011. I've since remarried. So when I say my husband, I'm talking about my second husband. That's another story. That was my second husband. My first husband has since passed away too, but that's a whole different story. Anyway, when I started working with energy and spirituality and doing that for myself and then for others, it was born out of grief, out of the loss of my husband at that time. But it has since transformed into a lot more than just dealing with grief. But that's always going to be a part of what I do, is energy work around grief and around people who are suffering that mental distress over loss. And so a lot of people tend to think, why do I focus on death all the time? But I don't just focus on death. Obviously, as a death doula, as that's part of what I do death work. I do work with people who are dying or who want to be prepared ahead for the inevitable time when they will die, because we all will. But death itself, as in human death, is only a tiny fraction of what I do. And I wanted to have this discussion today to talk about that, because people tend to assume that death is a huge part of what I do. And then how can I be talking about magic and spirituality and energy healing and spiritual business growth and development for entrepreneurs and that kind of thing? But the thing is, the death is only a small portion of what I do. And grief would be, if you wanted to categorize it, would be a larger portion, or a word that defines a larger portion of my work, because people tend to have energetic blocks, whether it be in their spiritual life or in their everyday life or in their business endeavors, whatever, as a result of grief. They just may not understand that, recognize that, know that, or know how to move past that. So loss, change of any kind can lead to grief, and how you respond to that grief will be unique to you. And all of it ties together into a whole person. None of us are going to escape life without having experienced grief. It's just a part of life. Unless we die as infants, as young children, whatever, then we may not. But if you're listening to this, you're more than likely an adult, and you have already experienced loss of some sort. And how you respond to that is going to be unique to you. But all of that to say, death is only a small part of what I do. And if you want to categorize what I do, because I call myself a multi-passionate person, and I have a lot of passions, and I work with all my loves in my business, and I'm not going to limit myself to one topic. But if you want to lump everything I do under one term, I guess it could be energy work around grief, around dealing with change and loss. But I just wanted to clear the air and say that death is only a small part of that. So if you haven't lost someone yet in your life, you still have every right to be in my stratosphere of what I do in my business, because you're human and you are going to experience change. You're going to experience loss. At some point, you're going to experience death. Your own, somebody else's, whatever. But I'm glad to have you here. So don't let thoughts of, I haven't experienced a close friend or loved one dying. Why am I here? Don't let that negativity into your life. That's bullshit talking. You can be here because it's all energy. It's all part of the human existence. And I'm just here to help you or to support you in having a more passionate, thriving, energetic life. And the way to do that is to overcome the blocks that are in your life due to grief. And so, yeah, that's why I'm here. Let me know if that resonates in any way, shape, or form for you.
Love this podcast? How about giving me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app? If you want more content from me, subscribe to my newsletter over at livingmoonmeditation.com. And if you'd like to help me keep the lights on, I appreciate your donations. I have the links for that in the show notes.